The open road stretched before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast American landscape. My loyal companion, a scruffy mutt with soulful eyes, sat contentedly in the passenger seat, his head hanging out the window as we cruised along. We were on a cross-country adventure, just the two of us, with Yellowstone National Park as our next destination. As we approached the park, my excitement grew. I had heard so much about its natural wonders, the geysers, hot springs, and diverse wildlife. The plan was simple: find a campsite, set up for the night, and spend the next few days exploring this magnificent wilderness. The sun was already dipping low on the horizon when we finally reached the park entrance. After paying the entry fee and receiving a map from the ranger, I drove towards the first campground on my list. To my dismay, a large "full" sign greeted me at the entrance. No problem, I thought. There are plenty of other campgrounds in the park. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a long and frustrating search. As I drove from one campground to another, the story remained the same. Every single site was occupied. The park was teeming with visitors, all eager to experience the beauty of Yellowstone during the peak season. I circled the park's main loop road multiple times, hoping that someone might have left early, or that a last-minute cancellation would open up a spot. With each passing minute, the sun sank lower, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink. Under different circumstances, I would have marveled at the breathtaking sunset, but my growing concern about finding a place to sleep overshadowed its beauty. As darkness settled over the park, I realized I had to make a decision. The idea of sleeping in my car in a parking lot didn't appeal to me, especially with my furry friend in tow. That's when I remembered passing a secluded trailhead earlier. It wasn't an official campsite, but it seemed like the best option given the circumstances. With a mix of trepidation and determination, I steered my vehicle back to the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, which was both a relief and slightly unnerving. I quickly gathered my gear, strapping my frame pack to my back and ensuring I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few basic tools. My dog seemed to sense the change in plans, wagging his tail excitedly as we set off down the trail. The path was barely visible in the fading light, but I had a good flashlight to guide our way. We hiked for about 15 minutes, moving deeper into the wilderness, before I decided we had gone far enough to avoid detection. Veering off the trail, we made our way to the edge of a small clearing. It was a picturesque spot, with a grassy meadow surrounded by towering pines. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of mountains against the star-studded sky. Despite the unplanned nature of our campsite, I couldn't help but feel a sense of adventure and connection with nature. Knowing the importance of minimizing our impact on the environment, I carefully selected a spot for our camp. I chose a flat area with minimal vegetation, hoping to leave as little trace as possible of our presence. My first task was to dig a small fire pit. Using a collapsible shovel from my pack, I scraped away the top layer of soil and created a circular depression. Next came the tent. I had practiced setting it up in my backyard before the trip, and that practice paid off now as I efficiently assembled our shelter for the night. My dog watched curiously, occasionally sniffing around the perimeter of our makeshift campsite. With the tent up, I turned my attention to dinner. I had packed some hot dogs, thinking they'd be an easy meal to cook over a campfire. As I gathered some small branches and kindling for the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruders in this wild place. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me pause and look around, half expecting to see a park ranger or wild animal emerging from the darkness. Once the fire was going, I roasted the hot dogs on long sticks. My canine companion sat patiently, his eyes fixed on the sizzling meat. The aroma of cooking food filled the air, and I hoped it wouldn't attract any unwanted visitors. We shared our simple meal, the hot dogs tasting better than any gourmet dish in that moment of hunger and exhaustion. After dinner, I meticulously cleaned up our site. I knew the importance of proper food storage in bear country, so I gathered all our leftovers and trash into a bag. Using some rope from my pack, I hung the bag high in a nearby tree, well away from our tent. It was a bit of a struggle in the dark, but I knew it was crucial for our safety. With everything secured, I extinguished the fire, making sure to douse it thoroughly with water from my canteen. I scattered the wet ashes and covered the fire pit with the soil I had initially removed, trying to erase any evidence of our presence. Exhausted from the long day of driving and the unexpected hike, I crawled into the tent with my dog. The lightweight sleeping bag provided welcome warmth against the cool night air. As I lay there, listening to the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl, I felt a mix of emotions: excitement at the adventure, a twinge of guilt for camping in an unauthorized area, and a hint of apprehension about what the night might bring. Sleep came quickly, but it was destined to be a night of interruptions. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when the first howl pierced the night. At first, it sounded distant, maybe a few miles away. In my groggy state, I marveled at the haunting beauty of the sound. It was a reminder that we were in true wilderness, sharing the land with its wild inhabitants. As I started to drift back to sleep, another howl rang out, this time noticeably closer. My dog, who had been sleeping soundly at my feet, raised his head, ears perked in alert curiosity. I patted him reassuringly, trying to convey a calmness I didn't entirely feel. The howls continued, each time seeming to come from a different direction and growing ever closer. It was hard to judge distance in the dark, unfamiliar terrain, but I estimated that the wolves were now at the edge of the meadow where we were camped. My mind raced, trying to recall everything I knew about wolf behavior. I knew attacks on humans were extremely rare, but that did little to calm my racing heart. Soon, the sounds of padding feet and sniffing noses circled our tent. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. My dog, to his credit, remained silent, though I could feel him trembling slightly against my leg. The wolves seemed curious, investigating this strange new object in their territory. Those minutes felt like hours as we waited, hoping the wolves would lose interest and move on. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the sounds began to recede. A distant howl signaled that the pack was moving away, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. As the adrenaline subsided, exhaustion took over once more, and I drifted back to sleep. The next time I awoke, the sky outside was still dark, but I had the sense that several hours had passed. This time, however, the sounds that roused me were very different. Heavy footfalls circled the tent, accompanied by deep, huffing breaths. My first thought was bear, and a jolt of fear shot through me. While wolves were unlikely to attack, a hungry or curious bear could easily see our tent as something to investigate more thoroughly. The unseen visitor seemed particularly interested in the spot where I had buried the fire pit. I silently cursed myself for not being more thorough in cleaning up. Even the faintest scent of food could attract a bear's keen nose. After nosing around the fire pit area, the bear turned its attention to our tent. Each lumbering step it took sent vibrations through the ground, emphasizing its massive size. As it circled closer, I knew I had to do something to deter it without provoking an attack. With trembling hands, I reached for my flashlight. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I flicked it on, illuminating the tent from within. The sudden appearance of the glowing dome seemed to startle the bear. I heard a surprised huff, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. Even after the sounds of the bear faded away, sleep eluded me. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig brought me to full alert. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, I finally felt it was safe enough to peer outside. Unzipping the tent cautiously, I stuck my head out and surveyed our surroundings. The meadow was peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of our nighttime visitors. A light rain had begun to fall, adding a misty quality to the scene that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Knowing we needed to leave quickly, I began packing up our campsite. The rain made everything damp, adding to the challenge of breaking camp. My dog seemed eager to be on the move, perhaps still unsettled by the night's events. We hiked back to the trailhead in record time, my pace quickened by the desire to return to the relative safety of populated areas. As we drove away from the parking lot, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering excitement from our wilderness encounter. Luck was finally on our side as we found a campground with a vacancy that morning. As I was setting up my damp tent to dry, a park ranger approached, clipboard in hand. He asked about my previous night's accommodation, mentioning they had a record of my entry but no registered campsite. In a moment of panic, I lied, claiming I had slept in my truck in a parking lot. The ranger seemed skeptical but didn't press the issue, simply reminding me of the park's camping regulations and moving on. I felt a twinge of guilt for the deception, but was relieved to avoid any potential fines or reprimands. The rest of our time in Yellowstone was, thankfully, far less eventful. We spent our days exploring the park's famous attractions, watching Old Faithful erupt, marveling at the colorful hot springs, and observing herds of bison from a safe distance. Each night, I made sure we were safely checked into an official campsite well before dark. As our time in the park came to an end, we hit the road again, heading west towards Portland, Oregon. The journey took us through changing landscapes, from the rugged mountains of Idaho to the high desert of eastern Oregon, and finally into the lush greenery of the Pacific Northwest. We took our time, stopping at various campsites along the way. Each night, as I set up our tent in designated camping areas, I couldn't help but reflect on our Yellowstone adventure. While it had been frightening at times, it had also given me a profound respect for the wild places and creatures we share this planet with. Arriving in Portland felt like the end of an epic journey. The city's quirky charm and abundant green spaces were a welcoming sight after so many days on the road. We spent a week exploring the city and its surroundings, hiking in the Columbia River Gorge and along the Oregon coast. As I sat in a Portland coffee shop on our last day, planning the next leg of our journey, I couldn't help but smile at the memory of that night in Yellowstone. It had been unplanned, uncomfortable, and at times terrifying, but it was also an experience I would never forget. It had taught me about my own resilience, the unpredictability of nature, and the importance of respecting wildlife and wilderness areas. That night in Yellowstone, while not the comfortable camping experience I had initially planned, had become the defining moment of our cross-country adventure. It was a reminder that sometimes the most memorable experiences come from the unexpected turns in our journey, and that nature, in all its beauty and wildness, deserves our respect and admiration. As we prepared to leave Portland and continue our journey, I felt a renewed sense of excitement for the road ahead. Whatever challenges or adventures awaited us, I knew we were ready to face them, my loyal dog and I, two travelers making our way across this vast and beautiful country. 2 summers ago, I embarked on what was supposed to be a peaceful 8-mile backpacking trip into the remote wilderness surrounding Mount Hood, Oregon with my girlfriend. Little did we know that this adventure would become etched in our memories as one of the most terrifying experiences of our lives. As we trekked through the rugged terrain, the pristine beauty of the Pacific Northwest surrounded us. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine, and the sound of our footsteps on the trail was accompanied by the occasional chirping of birds. After several hours of hiking, we finally reached our destination, a serene lake nestled in a valley, surrounded by a forest of dead trees. The sight of the dead forest was both eerie and captivating. The skeletal remains of once majestic trees stood like silent sentinels around the lake, their bare branches reaching towards the sky. We chose a spot to set up camp, carefully considering our surroundings. As we worked on pitching our tent, I noticed another tent across the lake. It was the only other sign of human presence in this remote area, but strangely, we never saw anyone at that site. As we settled into our campsite, the sky began to change. Dark clouds started rolling in from the distant hills, and a sense of unease crept over us. We had checked the weather forecast before our trip, and thunderstorms were uncommon in this region, especially during this time of year. Nevertheless, we decided to prepare for the worst. We worked quickly to secure our tent, driving the stakes deep into the ground and double-checking all the guy lines. I dug a small trench around the perimeter of our tent to divert any potential rainwater. All the while, we kept glancing nervously at the dead trees surrounding us. Their dry, brittle branches looked like they could snap at any moment in strong winds. As we finished our preparations, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the bare branches of the dead forest. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the atmosphere grew heavy with the promise of rain. We gathered our belongings and huddled inside our tent, hoping it would provide adequate shelter from the impending storm. The rain started as a light patter on the tent fabric but quickly intensified into a torrential downpour. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the ominous rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. The storm had arrived in full force, and we were trapped in its midst. Inside our tent, we held on to each other, our hearts pounding in sync with the thunderclaps. The wind howled mercilessly, and we could hear the creaking and groaning of the dead trees all around us. Every few minutes, a loud crack would pierce through the cacophony of the storm, the sound of branches snapping under the force of the wind. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. The darkness outside was periodically illuminated by brilliant flashes of lightning, casting eerie shadows of the skeletal trees on our tent walls. Each flash was followed by a deafening boom of thunder that made us flinch involuntarily. Throughout this ordeal, a nagging thought kept returning to my mind: the other campsite across the lake. We hadn't seen anyone there all day, and even now, in the midst of this ferocious storm, there was no sign of activity. No flashlights, no voices calling out, nothing. It was as if the other tent had been abandoned long ago. Hours passed, feeling like an eternity. The relentless assault of wind and rain on our tent, combined with the constant fear of a falling tree, made sleep impossible. We lay awake, alert to every sound, every gust of wind that threatened to tear our shelter apart. Eventually, exhaustion began to overtake us, and we drifted into a fitful sleep as the storm gradually began to subside. However, our night of terror was far from over. I'm not sure how long we had been asleep when I was jolted awake by a strange sensation. It took me a moment to realize what had woken me. A beam of light was moving across the fabric of our tent. My heart leaped into my throat as I recognized the distinctive pattern of a flashlight beam. Someone was outside our tent, in the middle of the night, in this remote wilderness. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as the light moved slowly around our tent. My girlfriend stirred beside me, and I gently squeezed her hand, silently willing her to remain quiet. The beam of light paused at the entrance of our tent, and I could see the faint silhouette of a figure through the fabric. In that moment, a primal fear took over. I shouted out, my voice hoarse and trembling, "Who's there?" The reaction was immediate. The light vanished, plunging us back into darkness. We heard the sound of rapid footsteps crunching on wet leaves, growing fainter as whoever it was retreated into the night. For the rest of the night we remained awake, huddled together in our sleeping bags, straining our ears for any sound of the mysterious visitor's return. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the forest around us sent a fresh wave of fear through our bodies. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we cautiously emerged from our tent. The aftermath of the storm was evident all around us. Broken branches littered the ground, and several of the dead trees had toppled over, their decaying roots unable to withstand the force of the wind. With trepidation, I turned my gaze towards the other campsite across the lake. In the gray light of early morning, it looked completely deserted. The tent was still there, but there was no sign of life, no movement, no smoke from a morning campfire, nothing. We quickly packed up our belongings, our hands shaking as we dismantled our tent and stuffed our gear into our backpacks. Neither of us spoke much. The events of the night had left us shaken and eager to return to civilization. As we hiked out of the wilderness, retracing our steps from the day before, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often I would turn around abruptly, half expecting to see someone following us. But there was never anyone there, just the silent, indifferent forest. The memory of that night still haunts me to this day. The ferocity of the unexpected storm, the vulnerability we felt in our fragile tent surrounded by precarious dead trees, and the chilling encounter with the unknown flashlight bearer. It all comes back to me in vivid detail during quiet moments. I've often wondered about the other campsite. Who had set up that tent? Were they somehow connected to our nocturnal visitor? Or had they left before the storm, leaving their tent behind? These questions remain unanswered, adding to the unsettling nature of the experience. This incident served as a stark reminder of the unpredictable and sometimes frightening nature of the wilderness. While the great outdoors offers unparalleled beauty and the opportunity for adventure, it also demands respect and caution. Nature's power, as demonstrated by the sudden storm, is awe-inspiring and terrifying in equal measure. Moreover, the encounter with the mysterious figure underscored the vulnerability one can feel in remote areas. The very isolation that makes these places so appealing can also leave one exposed to potential threats, both natural and human. Despite the fear we experienced, this trip also reinforced the importance of preparation and adaptability in outdoor adventures. Our quick actions to secure our campsite before the storm likely prevented a worse outcome. And while the night was terrifying, we managed to keep our wits about us and make it through safely. In the years since this incident, I've continued to explore the wilderness, but always with a heightened sense of awareness and respect for the potential dangers. I've learned to be more thorough in checking weather forecasts, to always have a contingency plan, and to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. The experience has become a story I share with fellow outdoor enthusiasts, not to discourage them from exploring, but to emphasize the importance of being prepared and vigilant. It serves as a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, unexpected challenges can arise, and how we respond to these challenges can make all the difference. As I reflect on that night by the lake, surrounded by dead trees and buffeted by a furious storm, I'm reminded of the dual nature of wilderness experiences. They can be sources of great joy and profound connection with nature, but they can also be crucibles that test our courage and resourcefulness. In the end, it's these challenges that often lead to the most growth and the most memorable adventures, even if they're not always the kind of memories we set out to make. I understand. You want the story to remain realistic, similar to the original version. I'll revise the expanded story to keep it grounded in reality, removing any supernatural or overly dramatic elements. Here's a more realistic expansion of your original camping tale. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stepped off the plane in Colorado. My college friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months, a tradition we'd kept alive since graduation to stay connected despite our busy lives. This year, we'd chosen the rugged beauty of the Colorado mountains for our annual adventure. After collecting our luggage, we made our way to the rental car agency. The excitement was palpable as we loaded our gear into the trunk of a sturdy SUV, perfect for navigating the winding mountain roads ahead. As we pulled out of the airport, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and nostalgia. These trips were always a highlight of my year, a chance to reconnect with old friends and escape the hustle of everyday life. The drive into the mountains was breathtaking. Towering pines lined the roads, their branches reaching towards the clear blue sky. We chatted animatedly, catching up on each other's lives and reminiscing about our college days. As the elevation increased, the air grew cooler, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Our first night of camping was uneventful, spent in a bustling campground near a popular hiking trail. We shared stories around the campfire, roasted marshmallows, and gazed at the stars, marveling at how much brighter they seemed away from the city lights. The next day, we decided to venture deeper into the wilderness, seeking a more secluded spot for our second night. After hours of driving and exploring, we stumbled upon a small, hidden campground. It was perfect individual lots spaced far apart, surrounded by dense forest with a babbling creek nearby. We chose a spot close to the water, thinking it would be convenient for washing up after our hikes. As we set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I dismissed it as paranoia, chalking it up to being in an unfamiliar environment. We worked efficiently, pitching our tent and organizing our gear while daylight still lingered. The sound of the creek and the rustling leaves created a soothing ambiance, and I felt my earlier unease begin to dissipate. With our campsite established, we decided to treat ourselves to dinner in the nearest town. The small mountain community was charming, with log cabins and local businesses lining the main street. We found a cozy restaurant and enjoyed hearty meals, swapping stories and laughing until our sides hurt. The sun had long since set by the time we returned to our campsite. As we approached, something felt off. The beams from our flashlights revealed our tent flap was open, swaying gently in the night breeze. A chill ran down my spine as we cautiously approached. It was clear someone or something had been through our belongings. Backpacks were unzipped, sleeping bags unfurled, and our food supplies scattered. We searched the surrounding area, but found no sign of the intruder. Despite the unsettling discovery, we decided to stay put for the night. After all, we reasoned, it was probably just some curious wildlife. To shake off the eerie feeling, we grabbed our toiletries and headed to the creek to freshen up before bed. The water was ice cold, shocking our systems as we quickly washed. As I was drying off, movement on the opposite bank caught my eye. Squinting into the darkness, I could make out a human-like figure standing motionless among the trees. My heart began to race. Not wanting to alarm my friends or alert the watcher, I casually suggested we head back to camp. Once we were out of earshot, I shared what I'd seen. The mood shifted instantly from relaxed to tense as we hurried back to our site. Given the earlier intrusion and my sighting by the creek, we unanimously decided to sleep in the car that night. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but felt infinitely safer than the exposed tent. Sleep came fitfully as we took turns keeping watch, our eyes scanning the moonlit clearing for any sign of movement. In the dead of night, I jolted awake, my senses on high alert. Peering out the window, my blood ran cold. A dark figure was crouched by our tent, slowly unzipping the entrance. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as the intruder discovered the tent was empty. Then, to my horror, they turned towards our car. Adrenaline surged through me as I frantically shook my friends awake. In a moment of quick thinking, I lunged for the steering wheel and slammed my hand on the horn. The sudden, piercing noise shattered the night's silence. What happened next haunts me to this day. Instead of fleeing in panic, the figure calmly stood up and walked away, disappearing into the thick forest without a hint of urgency. It was as if they were completely unfazed by our presence or the blaring horn. None of us slept for the remainder of the night. We sat in tense silence, eyes glued to the windows, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we breathed a collective sigh of relief. Without discussion, we began packing up our belongings. The campsite fee for the second night seemed a small price to pay for our safety. As we loaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The rest of our trip was spent at a different campground, one closer to civilization and other campers. While we tried to salvage our vacation, enjoying hikes and scenic views, an undercurrent of unease persisted. Every unexpected sound in the forest made us flinch, and we found ourselves constantly looking over our shoulders. On our final night, gathered around the campfire, we finally discussed the events at the Creekside campground. Each of us shared our theories about who might have been stalking us. Was it a disturbed individual living in the woods? A thrill seeker trying to scare campers? Or perhaps a fellow camper with ill intentions? We never came to a conclusion, and in some ways, the not knowing made it worse. The experience left an indelible mark on all of us. While we continued our annual camping trips in the years that followed, we were never quite as carefree as we had been before. As I sit here now, years later, recounting this story, I can still feel the icy grip of fear that seized me that night. The Colorado mountains, once a symbol of adventure and freedom, now hold a darker significance in my memory. I've often wondered if other campers have had similar experiences in those woods, or if we were uniquely unfortunate. Our brush with the unknown served as a stark reminder of how vulnerable we can be in the wilderness, and how thin the line is between exhilarating adventure and genuine danger. It taught us to trust our instincts, to be prepared for the unexpected, and to never take our safety for granted. While I still love the outdoors and continue to seek out new adventures, I approach them with a heightened awareness of my surroundings. That night in Colorado taught me that sometimes the greatest threats aren't from wildlife or the elements, but from the unpredictable nature of other humans. As I finish recounting this tale, I find myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking at the edge of the tree line. The rational part of my mind knows it's just my imagination, but a small part of me will always wonder, what if it wasn't? Our journey began on a warm summer morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as my friend and I packed our bicycles with the essentials for our trip. We had meticulously planned our route, focusing on bike trails that would lead us through picturesque landscapes and quaint towns. Our panniers were filled with camping gear, clothes, and enough food to sustain us for several days of hard riding. The first day of our journey was filled with excitement and anticipation. We pedaled along winding trails, surrounded by lush greenery and the occasional glimpse of wildlife. The rhythmic sound of our bike tires on the path and the chirping of birds created a soothing backdrop to our adventure. We chatted intermittently, discussing our hopes for the trip and the sights we expected to see. As the day wore on, our muscles began to ache, but we pushed forward, determined to reach our planned stopping point. By late afternoon, we found ourselves at the edge of a small town, where we decided to rest for the night. With no official campgrounds nearby, we scouted the area and found a secluded spot in a local park. We set up our tent discreetly, cooked a simple meal of beans and bread on our portable stove, and fell into an exhausted sleep. The second day brought new challenges. The terrain became more undulating, testing our endurance as we tackled steep inclines and enjoyed thrilling descents. We passed through several small communities, stopping occasionally to refill our water bottles and stretch our legs. The weather remained favorable, with a gentle breeze keeping us cool as we rode. As evening approached on the second day, we found ourselves without an ideal camping spot. After some deliberation, we made the unconventional decision to set up camp in a quiet corner of a cemetery. It wasn't our first choice, but it offered a flat, secluded area away from the main road. We treated the space with utmost respect, careful not to disturb any graves or memorial items. The third day of our journey was when we finally reached our destination. The small town welcomed us with its charming streets and friendly atmosphere. After days of physical exertion and basic meals, we were eager to indulge in some comfort and relaxation. We spent the afternoon by the town's lake, relishing the cool water against our sun-warmed skin. The swim was refreshing, washing away the dust and fatigue of our journey. As we floated on our backs, gazing at the clear blue sky, we reflected on the miles we had covered and the sights we had seen. That evening, we treated ourselves to a hearty meal at a local restaurant. The taste of fresh, hot food was a welcome change from our camp cuisine. We savored every bite, recounting our adventures to each other and planning the return journey. As night fell, we faced the question of where to spend our final night before heading home. Given our previous experience, we decided to return to the cemetery we had passed on our way into town. It was quiet, away from the bustle of the main street, and offered a soft area of mulch that seemed perfect for our tent. We set up camp efficiently, our routine now well established after several nights on the road. The air was filled with anticipation, not just for our impending return home, but also because it was the eve of the 4th of July. As darkness settled around us, the sky began to light up with sporadic fireworks, a prelude to the next day's celebrations. Sitting outside our tent, we watched the colorful explosions paint the night sky. The atmosphere was peaceful, yet there was an underlying tension that we couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the unusual setting, or maybe it was something more. As we sat in contemplation, both of us experienced odd sensations. More than once I caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. My friend admitted to similar experiences, and we exchanged uneasy glances. Our curiosity piqued, and perhaps seeking to dispel our growing unease, we decided to explore our surroundings. Armed with a flashlight, we began to wander among the gravestones, reading inscriptions and reflecting on the lives they represented. It was during this walk that we came across a particularly poignant sight, a baby's grave adorned with toy cars. The small vehicles, carefully arranged on the ledge of the gravestone, spoke volumes about the love and loss experienced by this child's family. As we stood in silent respect, a sudden chilling wind swept through the cemetery. It was brief, lasting only a few seconds, but it left us both shivering. What happened next defied logical explanation. As we turned to continue our walk, we both saw it. A small, translucent figure, child-sized, gliding away from us. It was visible for only a moment before it simply vanished into the night air. We stood frozen, our eyes wide, trying to process what we had just witnessed. Shaken by the experience, we hurried back to our tent. Sleep did not come easily that night. We tossed and turned, each lost in our own thoughts about what we had seen. Every small sound seemed magnified in the darkness, and more than once we woke with a start, convinced we had heard footsteps or whispers just outside our tent. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, we felt a sense of relief. We had made it through the night, and it was time to pack up and begin our journey home. I unzipped the tent flap, eager to step out into the morning air and shake off the unnerving experiences of the night. But as I opened the tent, I was stopped in my tracks. There, on the ground just outside our tent, lay 2 toy cars. They were identical to the ones we had seen on the baby's grave the night before. My friend and I exchanged bewildered looks, each silently questioning if the other had moved the cars during the night. But we both knew we hadn't left the tent. With a mixture of awe and trepidation, we walked back to the baby's grave. Sure enough, there were 2 empty spots where cars had been the previous evening. We carefully placed the cars back in their original positions, our hands trembling slightly as we did so. As we packed up our campsite and prepared to leave, a profound silence hung between us. The events of the night had shaken our understanding of the world. I had always considered myself a skeptic when it came to supernatural occurrences, but what we had experienced in that cemetery was beyond rational explanation. Our ride home was quieter than the journey out had been. We pedaled steadily, each lost in our own thoughts about what we had witnessed. The beautiful scenery that surrounded us seemed somehow different now, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a world more mysterious and complex than we had previously imagined. As we neared our hometown, we finally began to discuss the events in the cemetery. We shared our fears, our doubts, and our newfound belief in things beyond our understanding. We agreed that while the experience had been unsettling, it had also been profound, opening our eyes to possibilities we had never before considered. Our bicycle trip had started as a simple adventure, a chance to challenge ourselves physically and explore new places. But it had become so much more. We had not only tested our physical limits, but also expanded the boundaries of our beliefs. The memory of that night in the cemetery would stay with us forever, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that can only be understood through experience. As we parted ways at the end of our journey, we made a pact to return to that cemetery one day, not out of a morbid fascination, but out of respect for the experiences we had there and the truths we had glimpsed. We knew that our lives had been changed by this trip, and that we would never look at the world quite the same way again. The toy cars, the ghostly figure, the inexplicable movements, all of these had combined to create an experience that challenged our perceptions of reality. And as we returned to our normal lives, we carried with us a new sense of wonder and a deeper appreciation for the mysteries that surround us every day. Our bicycle trip had been more than just a physical journey. It had been a journey of the spirit, one that had opened our eyes to the possibility that there is more to this world than what we can see and touch. And for that, we were profoundly grateful. It was a crisp October morning when I, Christopher Anderson, decided to document the events that unfolded during what was supposed to be a simple camping trip with my college friends. The chill in the air seemed to foreshadow the horror that awaited us in the depths of the forest. Little did we know that our lives would be forever changed by the time the sun rose again. Fred Williams was never the type to stand out in a crowd. In high school, he was the quiet loner who kept to himself, his nose often buried in a book or his eyes fixed on the horizon, lost in thought. It wasn't until college that Fred began to come out of his shell, thanks in large part to his girlfriend Melanie Cooper. Melanie was Fred's polar opposite in many ways. Where he was reserved, she was outgoing. Where he preferred solitude, she thrived in social situations. Her warm smile and infectious laugh drew people to her like moths to a flame. It was a mystery to many how these two had ended up together, but to those who knew them well, it made perfect sense. They balanced each other perfectly. Pete Donovan, Fred's best friend, was the third member of our unlikely quartet. Pete was the kind of guy who walked into a room and immediately commanded attention. He was loud, boisterous, and had an ego the size of Texas. But beneath that brash exterior was a heart of gold. Pete cared deeply for his friends, even if he had an odd way of showing it sometimes. Rounding out our group was Jacqueline Rodriguez, Pete's girlfriend. Jacqueline was the quintessential gossip queen. She always seemed to know what was happening before anyone else. And she wasn't shy about sharing that information. Her penchant for spreading rumors had gotten her into hot water more than once, but she always managed to charm her way out of trouble. As I sit here, recounting these details about my friends, I can't help but feel a pang of nostalgia mixed with dread. If only we had known what fate had in store for us, perhaps we would have chosen a different path. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths. The idea for the camping trip came about during one of our regular study sessions at the college library. We were all feeling the pressure of midterms, and Pete, in his typical fashion, suggested we blow off some steam. "What we need," he declared, slamming his textbook shut, "is a good old-fashioned camping trip, just the four of us out in the wilderness, away from all this stress." Jacqueline wrinkled her nose at the suggestion. "Camping? Pete, honey, you know how I feel about bugs and dirt." "Come on, Jackie," Pete cajoled, using the nickname he knew she secretly loved. "It'll be fun. We can roast marshmallows, tell ghost stories, and hey, maybe you'll even pick up some juicy gossip from the woodland creatures." That last bit made Jacqueline crack a smile despite her reservations. Melanie, always the peacemaker, chimed in. "I think it sounds like a great idea. What do you think, Fred?" Fred, who had been quietly listening to the exchange, nodded slowly. "I know a good spot," he said. "It's in the woods near our hometown. I used to go there with the Boy Scouts." And just like that, our fate was sealed. We spent the next week planning and preparing for our trip. Fred took charge of the logistics, making sure we had all the necessary equipment. Melanie was in charge of food, promising to bring enough marshmallows to feed a small army. Pete volunteered to handle transportation, while Jacqueline complained, but we all knew she'd end up enjoying herself once we got there. None of us could have predicted how wrong we were. The day of our departure arrived, and we piled into Pete's beat-up Chevy Suburban. The vehicle had seen better days, but Pete swore it was reliable. "This baby's gotten me through thick and thin," he boasted, as we loaded our gear into the back. The drive to the campsite was filled with laughter and excited chatter. Jacqueline regaled us with the latest campus gossip, while Pete sang along badly to the classic rock station on the radio. Fred sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally offering directions to Pete. As we drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to grow taller and closer together. The sunlight filtering through the canopy created dappled patterns on the road, and the air grew cooler. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. Finally, after what seemed like hours of driving, we arrived at the clearing Fred had chosen for our campsite. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by towering pines and oaks. A small stream burbled nearby, its clear water sparkling in the afternoon sun. "This is perfect, Fred," Melanie exclaimed, giving her boyfriend a quick peck on the cheek. Fred blushed, clearly pleased with her approval. We set about setting up camp, working together like a well-oiled machine. Fred and Pete tackled the tents, while Melanie and Jacqueline gathered firewood. I helped where I could, but mostly I found myself observing my friends, marveling at how well we worked together despite our differences. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, we gathered around the fire pit Fred had constructed. Pete produced a cooler full of beer from the back of the Suburban, earning a whoop of approval from Jacqueline. "Now it's a party," she grinned, cracking open a can. Melanie rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Just remember, We're in the middle of nowhere. If you drink too much and need to pee in the middle of the night, you're on your own." We all laughed, but there was an undercurrent of nervousness to our mirth. As the darkness closed in around us, the forest seemed to come alive with strange sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the snap of a twig underfoot. Each noise made us jump a little, though we tried to hide it from each other. Little did we know, our fear was not unfounded. Something was indeed watching us from the shadows, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the night wore on and the fire burned low, Pete suggested we tell ghost stories. "It's tradition," he insisted, his words slightly slurred from the beer. "You can't go camping without telling ghost stories." Jacqueline groaned. "Do we have to? You know I hate scary stories." "Don't be such a baby," Pete teased. "I'll go first, and I promise it won't be too scary." Pete's story, as it turned out, was more comical than frightening. It was a rehashed version of the classic Hookman urban legend. But in Pete's telling, the protagonist ended up punching the killer in the face and saving the day. We all groaned and pelted him with marshmallows when he finished. "That was terrible," Jacqueline laughed. "My turn. I'll show you how it's done." Jacqueline's story was a bit more chilling. She spun a tale of a babysitter receiving threatening phone calls, only to discover that the calls were coming from inside the house. It was a story we'd all heard before, but Jacqueline's dramatic delivery had us on the edge of our seats. Melanie went next, telling a story about a girl staying at her roommate's creepy old house during a storm. The story ended with a shocking twist that made even Pete jump a little. Finally, it was Fred's turn. As he began to speak, his usually quiet demeanor seemed to shift. His voice took on a deeper, more serious tone, and his eyes gleamed in the firelight. "I'm going to tell you about something that really happened," he said, his gaze sweeping over each of us. "Something that happened right here in these woods." We all leaned in closer, drawn in by the intensity in Fred's voice. "There's a demon that roams these forests," Fred began. "It's been here for centuries, preying on the souls of the weak and unsuspecting. It's responsible for countless unexplained deaths and disappearances over the years." He went on to describe the demon in vivid detail. A nightmarish creature with the body of an ape, the hooves of a goat, the wings of a bat, and the head of a serpent. As he spoke, I could almost see the beast lurking just beyond the circle of firelight. "They say you can summon the demon by speaking its name," Fred continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Its name is—" He paused for dramatic effect, and we all held our breath. "Tesseract!" Fred suddenly shouted, causing us all to jump and spill our drinks. For a moment, silence reigned in the clearing. Then, as if on cue, a blood-curdling howl echoed through the trees. We all froze, our eyes wide with fear. "Very funny, Fred," Pete said after a moment, his voice shaky. "You almost had us going there for a minute." But Fred wasn't laughing. His face had gone pale, and he was staring into the darkness beyond our campfire with an expression of abject terror. I didn't do that," he whispered. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. We tried to laugh off the incident, blaming it on an overzealous coyote or some other woodland creature, but none of us could shake the feeling of dread that had settled over our campsite. We retired to our tents early, each couple in their own shelter. As I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, I couldn't help but replay Fred's story in my mind. The description of the demon was so vivid, so terrifying, that it seemed to have taken on a life of its own in my imagination. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a scream. It was Jacqueline's voice, high and panicked, cutting through the night like a knife. I scrambled out of my tent, heart pounding. The clearing was eerily quiet now, the only sound the crackling of the dying embers in our fire pit. Pete and Jacqueline's tent was empty, the flap hanging open. "Fred! Melanie!" I called out, my voice trembling. They emerged from their tent, looking just as confused and frightened as I felt. "What's going on?" Melanie asked, clinging to Fred's arm. "Where are Pete and Jackie?" Fred's face was grim. "We need to find them," he said, reaching for the flashlights we'd left by the fire. We spread out, calling for our friends as we searched the surrounding woods. The beam of my flashlight danced over the trees, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move and shift of their own accord. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump. It was Melanie who found Pete first, or rather, what was left of Pete. His body hung from a tree branch, grotesquely mutilated, his eyes wide and staring in frozen terror. Melanie's scream echoed through the forest, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. I ran towards her voice, my heart in my throat, but by the time I reached the spot, Melanie was gone. Only her flashlight remained, lying on the forest floor next to Pete's body. "Fred!" I yelled, panic rising in my chest. "Fred, where are you?" There was no answer. I was alone in the dark woods, surrounded by unseen horrors, and then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam trembling. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing not 10 feet away, was the creature from Fred's story. It was real, and it was more terrifying than any description could have conveyed. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, fixed on me with predatory intensity. I could smell its fetid breath, see the saliva dripping from its razor-sharp fangs. This was it, I thought. This was how I was going to die. But then something strange happened. The creature's gaze shifted, looking at something behind me. Its expression, if such a thing could be said to have an expression, changed from hunger to fear. I turned to see what had frightened the demon, and my jaw dropped in shock. There stood Fred, but not the Fred I knew. This Fred's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his mouth was curved in a cruel smile that sent chills down my spine. "Hello, old friend," Fred said, his voice deeper and more resonant than I'd ever heard it. "Did you miss me?" The demon let out a roar of fury and charged at Fred. What happened next was almost too fast for my eyes to follow. Fred moved with inhuman speed and grace, dodging the demon's attacks and landing blows of his own. The two creatures, for I could no longer think of Fred as human, battled fiercely, tearing up the forest around them. In the end, it was Fred who emerged victorious. He stood over the demon's broken body, panting heavily, his clothes torn and bloody. Then he turned to me, and I saw that his eyes had returned to normal. "Chris," he said, his voice weak and trembling, "I'm so sorry you had to see that." As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Fred and I sat by the rekindled campfire. The bodies of our friends had been respectfully covered and laid out nearby. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the night's events hanging heavy between us. Finally, Fred spoke. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice hoarse and tired. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Fred took a deep breath and began his story. "The demon I told you about last night, it's real. It's been haunting these woods for centuries, claiming victims and spreading fear. But what I didn't tell you is that I've encountered it before." He paused, his eyes distant as if looking into the past. "When I was a child, my father and I were in a car accident not far from here. The official report said my father lost control of the vehicle, but I knew the truth. I saw the demon appear in the middle of the road, causing my father to swerve and crash into a tree." Fred's hands were shaking now, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. My father, he was possessed by the demon in his final moments. I watched helplessly as it took control of him, forcing him to say terrible things before he died. But in his last breath he managed to fight back. He told me a secret, a way to defeat the demon. "What was it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "A ritual," Fred replied. "An ancient spell passed down through generations of those who fought against the demon. It allows a person to take on the demon's power, to fight fire with fire, so to speak. But it comes at a terrible cost." I thought back to the Fred I'd seen fighting the demon, the inhuman strength and speed he'd displayed. "You performed the ritual," I said. It wasn't a question. Fred nodded solemnly. "I've spent years preparing for this moment, waiting for the demon to show itself again. I brought us here knowing the risks, hoping to finally end this once and for all. But I never imagined—" His voice broke, and he gestured helplessly at the covered bodies of our friends. "Why didn't you tell us?" I asked, a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside me. We could have been prepared. We could have. No, Fred cut me off. Knowing wouldn't have saved them. The demon was too powerful. I'm so sorry, Chris. I never meant for any of this to happen. We lapsed into silence again, each lost in our own thoughts. As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the forest in hues of gold and green, I found myself wondering about the nature of good and evil, about the sacrifices we make in the name of protecting others. Fred had saved my life, had potentially saved countless future lives by destroying the demon. But at what cost? The lives of our friends? His own humanity? As if reading my thoughts, Fred spoke again. There's something else you need to know, Chris. The ritual. It's not a one-time thing. I've taken the demon's power into myself, but I can feel it trying to take control. I don't know how long I can hold it back. The weight of Fred's words hung heavy in the air between us. I stared at my friend, trying to reconcile the quiet, bookish Fred I knew with the powerful, tormented figure before me. What does that mean for you? I asked, dreading the answer. Fred's eyes met mine, and I saw a mixture of fear and resignation in them. It means I'm dangerous, Chris. The demon's power. It's like a poison spreading through me. I can feel its influence growing stronger with each passing moment. He stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth in front of the dying fire. I thought I could control it, use it to protect people. But now I'm not so sure. What if I become the very thing I sought to destroy? I rose to my feet, approaching Fred cautiously. There has to be a way to reverse it, right? Some kind of counter-ritual or... Fred shook his head, cutting me off. There's no going back. The ritual is permanent. I made my choice, and now I have to live with the consequences. A heavy silence fell between us, broken only by the soft crackling of the embers and the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. In the distance, a bird began to sing, a hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed at odds with the grim reality we faced. What will you do now? I asked, finally breaking the silence. Fred turned to face me, his expression resolute. I can't stay here. I can't risk hurting anyone else. I need to leave, go somewhere isolated where I can learn to control this thing inside me. My heart sank at his words, but I knew he was right. The Fred standing before me was no longer just my friend. He was something more, something potentially dangerous. Where will you go? I asked. I don't know, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Somewhere far away from civilization. Maybe the mountains or the deep wilderness. Somewhere I can't hurt anyone if I lose control. I nodded, understanding the gravity of his decision. What about Melanie's family? Pete's? Jacqueline's? What do we tell them? Fred's face contorted with pain at the mention of our lost friends. The truth would destroy them, Chris. It's better they don't know. Tell them there was an accident, a wildfire or a flash flood. Anything but the truth. The idea of lying to the families of our friends made me sick to my stomach. But I knew Fred was right. How could we possibly explain what had really happened? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Fred and I set about the grim task of dealing with the aftermath of the night's horrors. We carefully wrapped the bodies of our friends in blankets, treating them with all the respect and care we could muster. Fred insisted on carrying them back to the campsite himself, his newfound strength allowing him to bear burdens that would have been impossible for a normal man. We packed up the campsite in silence, erasing all traces of our presence. As we loaded the last of the gear into Pete's Suburban, Fred turned to me, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to go beyond mere grief. Chris, I need you to do something for me, he said, his voice low and urgent. When you get back to civilization, I need you to destroy everything. All the research I've done on the demon, all the books and notes in my dorm room. Burn it all. No one can ever know about this. I nodded, understanding the importance of his request. What about you? How will I know if you're okay? Fred managed a weak smile. You won't. It's better that way, for both of us. As we stood there, the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come pressed down on us like a physical force. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the burden we both carried, but words seemed woefully inadequate. In the end, we embraced, a fierce hug that spoke volumes more than words ever could. When we broke apart, I saw a glimmer of the old Fred in his eyes, a flash of the quiet, kind friend I had known. "Take care of yourself, Chris," he said softly, "and I'm sorry for everything." Before I could respond, Fred turned and walked into the forest. I watched him go, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared among the trees. Part of me wanted to call out, to beg him to come back, to find another way. But I knew this was how it had to be. I climbed into the driver's seat of the Suburban, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. As I drove away from the campsite, leaving behind the scene of so much horror and loss, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. But when I blinked, it was gone. The drive back to civilization was a blur. My mind raced with thoughts of how I would explain what had happened, how I would face the families of our lost friends, how I would ever be able to move on from this nightmare. When I finally reached the outskirts of our town, I pulled over to the side of the road. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I thought about Fred, out there somewhere in the wilderness, battling the darkness within him. I thought about Pete, Melanie, and Jacqueline, their lives cut tragically short. And I thought about myself, the sole survivor, burdened with a truth I could never share. As I sat there, watching the sun sink towards the horizon, I made a decision. I would honor Fred's request. I would destroy all evidence of what we had encountered in those woods. I would tell the necessary lies to give the families of our friends some closure. And then I would leave this place behind. There was a whole world out there, far from the shadows of this forest. Maybe if I went far enough, I could find a way to live with the memories of that terrible night. But deep down, I knew the truth. The horror we had faced, the losses we had suffered, the sacrifices that had been made, they would stay with me forever. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, heading towards an uncertain future. As I drove, I thought about Fred, out there somewhere in the wilderness, battling the darkness within him. I thought about Pete, Melanie, and Jacqueline, their lives cut tragically short. And I thought about myself, the sole survivor, burdened with a truth I could never share. The miles rolled by, and with each one I felt a small measure of the weight lifting from my shoulders. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could choose how to move forward. I decided then and there that I would live my life to the fullest, in honor of the friends I had lost. As night fell and the stars came out, I crossed the state line. In my rearview mirror, the forests of my hometown faded into darkness. Ahead of me lay open road, new possibilities, and the chance for a fresh start. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that place of horror and loss. The memories would always be with me, a constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the dark forces that lurk just out of sight. But I was determined to build a new life, one day at a time. As I drove on into the night, I made a silent promise to myself and to the memory of my friends. I would live, I would remember, and I would never again take for granted the precious, fragile nature of life and friendship. The road stretched out before me, leading to places unknown. As the last light of day faded from the sky, I realized that while one chapter of my life had closed, another was just beginning. Whatever lay ahead, I would face it with the strength and resilience forged in the crucible of that fateful camping trip. And so I drove on, leaving behind the horrors of the past and moving towards whatever the future might hold. The darkness had changed me, but it hadn't defeated me. In the end, that would have to be enough.